Lena Carter believed love was meant to be quiet. She believed it could exist without grand gestures, without late-night confessions or long embraces. In her world, love was reliability. It was routines and checklists, dinner at 7, bed at 10, and the silence between those things that never asked for more. That was the kind of love she shared with Ethan, and that's the kind of love she thought would last. Her job mirrored her life, methodical, precise. She was an archivist, spending her days handling delicate letters, cataloging the past lives of people who once wrote with urgency, fear, and passion. The kind of emotion she hadn't felt in years. Each letter was a puzzle, a fragment of someone else's truth. She preferred those truths to her own. Ethan worked in consulting. He traveled often, always apologizing, always promising to be more present once the next project ended. Lena stopped waiting for that to happen. He still kissed her cheek every morning, still said take care instead of I love you. She never asked why that changed. Then came the letters. A massive collection of 7,665 handwritten pages arrived for digital preservation. Wartime correspondences between a soldier and the woman he left behind. Lena was assigned to lead the project. She found herself drawn in not by the history, but by the emotion. She'd read a few each night after work, long after her shift ended, as though trying to understand what they had that she didn't. The letters weren't poetic. They were raw, sometimes desperate, sometimes dull, but always honest. He missed her laugh. She missed his smell. They talked about their future, their fights, their fears. Lena read them like confessions. And the more she read, the more she noticed her own absence in Ethan's life, in their home, in herself. Ethan became harder to reach. Longer trips, less explanation. His phone always upside down on the table. She didn't suspect infidelity then. She simply assumed he was tired or distant, or just another adult surrendering to the quiet failure of marriage. One evening, Lena found a letter that stopped her. It was dated 1944. The soldier wrote, "My darling, if war takes me, I want you to know I didn't waste a moment of our love pretending it wasn't real." She reread it several times. That night, she lay awake, wondering if she'd wasted moments pretending something was still real. Ethan came home the next morning. He was exhausted, or pretending to be. She watched him sleep on the couch, shoes still on, phone clenched in his palm. She stared at him and felt something uncoiled out that had lived too long in silence. It didn't feel like suspicion. It felt like mourning. Nadia, her mentor at work, noticed. She said little. Just a quiet comment as they shelved boxes of letters. People preserve what they're afraid to lose. You work too hard on saving stories that aren't yours. That line followed Lena home. Into her kitchen. Into the silence. She looked at Ethan then, his back turned, his fork scraping the plate, and tried to recall the last time he looked at her with love. Not politeness, not obligation. Actual warmth. She COULDN single quotes T. One night, while sorting through the final batch of letters, she came across an envelope with no return address. Just one sentence inside. The truth always waits, it never forgets. She wasn't sure who wrote it, or who it was meant for. But she felt like it had been written for her. By then, the letter project had become more than work. It was a mirror. She no longer saw herself in Ethan or in their past. She saw herself in the silences between the lines, in the longing left behind by people who had risked everything to say what mattered. She hadn't said anything that mattered in years. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just continued. Routine as usual. But something inside her had already shifted. Her silence, once safe, now felt like surrender. The letters spoke with more honesty than her marriage ever had. And she, the woman who cataloged the truth of others, was beginning to see the lie she lived in. Asterisk, it wasn't anger that rose. It was clarity. And Lena, for the first time, wasn't afraid of what the truth would cost. The message came through at 11:42 p.m. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch again. Half drunk, phone still unlocked in his hand. Lena didn't plan to look, but her eyes caught the name just an R at the top of a string of messages that ran deep. She scrolled. The words weren't coded or vague. They were full, intimate, unfiltered. Rachel said she missed his voice. Ethan said he dreamed of waking up next. To her. Lena read on, detached at first, like analyzing a stranger's handwriting. But each message blurred her vision. There were hundreds, pictures, memories. You make me feel seen. I don't feel guilty, just alive. Asterisk, there was no confrontation. No screaming. She simply put the phone down, walked to the bathroom, and locked the door. She stared at herself in the mirror. Her face was calm. Numbness had settled in like fog, coating everything, dulling the sharpness of betrayal. She didn't sleep that night. Just lay in bed beside him, awake in a life she no longer belonged to. Asterisk, in the days that followed, Lena said nothing. Evan remained clueless, too absorbed in his parallel life to notice the silence had changed. He still texted Rachel when Lena was in the shower. He still kissed her on the forehead when he left for fake meetings. And Lena let it happen. Not out of weakness, but to study it. Like she did the letters, examining its structure, the signs she'd missed, the way deception bloomed slowly and took root. Asterisk, she read through the messages again and again, cataloging her own undoing. Rachel wasn't a villain. In one message she asked if Ethan was lonely, and Ethan said, "She doesn't need me." That line hit deeper than the rest. Not because of the lie, but because of the projection. Lena needed him. Not in some dramatic, dependent way, but in the way people need honesty to feel human. Asterisk, the letters at work blurred with the ones on Ethan's phone. Both were stories of love, but only one told the truth. The war-torn confessions of strangers began to feel more sacred than the vows she'd exchanged with her husband. There was no dignity in what Ethan and Rachel shared. Only need, secrecy, and cowardice masked his passion. Asterisk, Lena isolated herself. Her appetite disappeared. The world lost flavor. She went to work, filed records, smiled politely, and avoided mirrors. Inside, grief sharpened. Not just for the marriage, but for the version of herself that had believed in it. She mourned her own silence, the years she spent waiting for Ethan. To notice her fading. Asterisk, eventually, Nadia pulled her aside. No pretense. Just a quiet question. Do you want to stay, or are you afraid to leave? Lena didn't answer. She couldn't, but the words stuck, louder than anything it said in weeks. Asterisk, that night, she opened the original wedding album. Not for nostalgia, but to feel how distant those smiles were. She barely recognized the woman in the photos. So full of expectation, so unaware. It felt like studying a ghost. She ripped the cover off. It didn't hurt. It felt necessary. Asterisk, the next morning, Ethan walked in humming. He asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. And as they sat in silence, sipping from separate cups, she finally asked him if he loved her. He froze, blinked, then answered, "I care. About you." That was all she needed to hear. Asterisk, when he left for work, she didn't follow him to the door. She opened the folder with Rachel's name and printed out a dozen screenshots. She wasn't looking for revenge. She just wanted to return the truth to the people it belonged to. The lies had overstayed their welcome. Asterisk, she mailed the envelope anonymously. No note, just evidence. Then she sat down with a blank page and began to write not a letter to Ethan or to Rachel, but to herself. It began, "You're allowed to leave the fire even if you lit it." Asterisk, in the days that followed, the pain became colder. cleaner. She knew Ethan would return home as if nothing had changed. And when he did, she would be gone not with noise, but with finality. Asterisk. The letters she once preserved now served a different purpose. They weren't history. They were proof that people had once chosen love with bravery. And that she, too, could choose something different, something honest, even if it began alone. Lena didn't leave immediately. She stayed long enough to pack quietly, to return her key to the landlord, to close the final folder at work. She didn't tell anyone except Nadia. Her silence wasn't secrecy, it was protection. She didn't want explanations or sympathy. She wanted space to breathe outside the shadow of someone else's betrayal. Asterisk. She moved into a one-bedroom flat above a bookstore. It was small, but it had light. The first night, she couldn't sleep. Not from grief, but from quiet. Real quiet. Not the dead silence she shared with Ethan, but the kind that welcomed healing. She sat in the center of the room, surrounded by boxes, and cried. Not from heartbreak, but from the weight lifting. Asterisk. Weeks passed. She no longer thought about what Ethan was doing. She stopped checking her phone. She deleted the screenshots. Rachel never responded, and Lena didn't care. That chapter was closed. What mattered now wasn't them. It was her. Asterisk. She spent time with the letters again, not to escape, but to understand. She read them slowly, savoring the honesty, the longing, the vulnerability. The lovers had nothing but words, and yet their connection felt more real than the life she'd just walked away from. The letters didn't pretend. They ached, pleaded, confessed. Lena began to highlight lines that moved her. One kept repeating, "Even if I don't return, know that I loved you completely." It wasn't about survival. It was about truth. Asterisk. The more she read, the more she began to write. At first, just journal entries. Then letters she'd never send to her younger self, to her mother, to the woman she'd become while trying to be small enough for someone else. Writing became a ritual. Every morning with coffee, every evening before sleep. Words poured out. Like water she didn't know she'd been holding in. Asterisk. One afternoon, she received an invitation from the museum. They wanted her to curate a public exhibit of the letter archive. She accepted. Not for the title, but for the opportunity to turn something that once held her together into something others could learn from. Asterisk. The exhibit was called 7,665 Letters of War and Wanting. She arranged them thematically: love, distance, fear, hope, farewell. The last section was hers. A single glass case with a handwritten note. "This collection taught me that truth is the only thing worth preserving." Visitors lingered there the longest. No one asked who wrote it. They didn't need to. Asterisk. Lena still thought about love, but not with regret. She understood now that love without truth is performance, that staying loyal to pain isn't strength, it's fear. Her heartbreak hadn't destroyed her. It had revealed her. Asterisk. On her walks, she smiled at strangers. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since college. Her therapist asked what she wanted next. Lena didn't know yet, but she knew it wouldn't come from waiting to be chosen. It would come from choosing herself. Asterisk. Nadia retired that winter. Before she left, she gave Lena a worn leather notebook. Inside was a single sentence: "You learn how to archive others. Now learn how to live uncensored." Asterisk. Spring came. Lena opened the windows for the first time in months. The city outside wasn't kinder, but it felt different. She felt different. Not healed in the clean way people expect, but stitched back together with intention. Not every wound leaves a scar visible to others. Some live in the way you answer your phone, in how you say your own name, in whether you flinch at love or lean toward it. Asterisk. She no longer needed closure from Ethan. His silence had been the answer. She no longer reread Rachel's words. She knew. Longer needed to be the woman who could endure everything. She could be the woman who chose peace over performance. One day, someone asked her if the letters ever made her sad. She shook her head. "No," she said. "They made me honest." The story wasn't about the war. It was about the courage to feel deeply despite it. That was what she carried forward, not the betrayal, but the bravery that followed. Lena didn't find love again right away, but she found freedom. She found clarity. She found herself not in someone else's reflection, but in her own voice. And that was worth every broken piece she had to leave behind. It started with the smallest things, sleeping through the night without waking up from echoes of conversations that never happened, making tea in silence without needing it to mean anything, learning to cook meals for one without sadness filling the kitchen. Lena didn't chase meaning anymore. She let it arrive in stillness. Healing didn't come like a storm. It came like dust settling. She didn't talk about Ethan, not because the pain was too raw, but because the story no longer centered around him. What she'd been through wasn't about the betrayal, it was about who she became after it. People often romanticized resilience, but Lena understood now that it wasn't about enduring. It was about releasing. Letting go of the versions of yourself shaped by someone else's indifference. The exhibit gained attention. People came from cities she'd never visited just to read the letters she once thought no one would care about. Survivors of different wars, different heartbreaks, left notes at the gallery. Some wrote poems, others confessed secrets. Lena read every single one. They were messy, brutal, human. She kept them in a folder titled Continuations. One evening, she received an email from a woman in Spain. It was Rachel. No apology. Just honesty. She wrote that she'd moved to Madrid, started over, left the chaos behind. She said Lena's silence had been louder than any confrontation. That it taught her something she hadn't learned until then, how to stop defending harm just because. It came wrapped in affection. Lena replied. Only one sentence. We both deserved more than him. Then she archived the email. Closure wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just the act of no longer needing to reply. Life moved on. New projects, new books, new mornings that didn't feel borrowed. Her apartment became her own in a way no shared home ever had. The furniture didn't match, the art was unframed, the floor squeaked in places, but it felt real. Lena learned to exist without explaining herself. She started a small writing group with strangers from the museum people who also had letters inside them, aching to be released. They met on Thursdays, read each other's pain out loud, and clapped when someone found the courage to finish a sentence that had once felt impossible. No judgment, just witnessing. That was enough. Months later, she received an invitation to speak at a conference. Topic: Archiving Emotion in Times of Crisis. She stood in front of a crowd of historians and said nothing about facts or dates. Instead, she said this: some stories aren't meant to be preserved in silence. They demand to be spoken, because silence only protects the one who caused the wound. When she stepped off stage, no one clapped right away. They just watched her, and that quiet felt like respect. She walked home that night under a sky filled with stars she hadn't noticed in years. Not because they weren't there, but because grief had narrowed her gaze. Now she looked up often, not for signs, not for hope, but because beauty no longer scared her. One Saturday morning, while cleaning old files, she found the first letter she'd ever archived. The one she had read before everything fell apart. She hadn't touched it in months. Her fingers traced the paper. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still sharp. If war takes me, I want you to know I didn't waste a moment of our love pretending it wasn't real. This time, she smiled. She realized she didn't regret loving Ethan. She regretted abandoning herself in the process. But even that held purpose. Without the fracture, she wouldn't have known what it meant to rebuild on truth alone. Asterisk, she placed the letter in a sealed case at the museum with no label. Just a date and the phrase, "Return to sender." Some stories weren't meant to be answered, just honored. Asterisk, by year's end, the letters were digitized, the exhibit made permanent, and Lena was offered a new role, director of curation. She accepted, not for the title, but because it allowed her to protect what mattered. Words, voices, truths. The things people risk everything to share. Asterisk, when asked later what saved her, she never said therapy, time, or self-help books. She always said the same thing. Someone had to tell the truth first. This time, it was me. Asterisk, that was her legacy. Not the hurt she endured, but the truth she refused to bury. And in a world that often rewarded silence, that choice made all the difference.